For more than a century, one technology quietly powered the movement of almost everything you have ever bought. The food on your table, the lumber that built your house, the fuel in your car, the appliances in your kitchen. Almost nothing in the modern economy moves without a diesel truck. Most people never think about it. It just works, invisibly, every single day. But when something that fundamental starts to shift, even slightly, the consequences can ripple through industries that seem completely unrelated to transportation. That is the story worth paying attention to right now. Trucking is not glamorous. It does not make headlines the way technology stocks do. But consider the scale for a moment. In the United States alone, trucks move roughly 70% of all freight by value. In Europe, that number is even higher for short and medium-distance freight. The entire just-in-time manufacturing system that modern industry depends on, the system that keeps store shelves stocked and assembly lines running, is built on the assumption that diesel trucks will show up on time, every time at a cost that makes the whole system economically viable. Remove that assumption, and you start to understand why freight economics matter far more than most people realize. The economics of trucking have been under pressure for years, and most of the pressure has been invisible to the average consumer. Diesel fuel is the largest single operating cost for most fleets, often representing 30 to 40% of total expenses. Driver shortages in both the United States and Europe have pushed labor costs sharply higher. Maintenance on diesel powertrains, with their hundreds of moving parts, complex transmissions, and exhaust systems, adds another significant layer of expense. And now, on top of all of that, emissions regulations on both sides of the Atlantic are tightening in ways that will force fleet operators to make decisions they have been deferring for years. The pressure is building from multiple directions at once. Here is a number that most people outside the freight industry have never heard. In parts of Europe, toll costs have already surpassed fuel costs as the largest single operating expense for long-haul trucking fleets. Road pricing systems across Germany, France, and other major freight corridors now charge rates that vary based on vehicle emissions. The cleaner the truck, the lower the toll. That is not a minor detail. That is a regulatory system specifically designed to change the economic calculation of running a diesel fleet, and it is already in effect, not coming in the future. Already running, already costing money, already changing the math. Europe is a particularly important place to watch right now, precisely because the regulatory pressure there is more advanced than anywhere else in the world. The European Union has set a target requiring that most new heavy trucks sold from 2040 onward must be emissions-free. That is not a distant goal. For fleet operators making capital allocation decisions today, a truck purchased in 2026 could still be on the road in 2041. The depreciation schedules, the resale values, the financing assumptions, all of it gets complicated when regulators are signaling that the asset you are buying today may face serious restrictions within its expected operating lifetime. That kind of regulatory visibility changes how serious buyers think about fleet replacement cycles. The zero-emission share of heavy truck sales in Europe right now is roughly 1.6%. That number sounds small, and it is. But it also tells you something important. The transition is real, it is measurable, it is happening, and it is still in the very early stages. That gap between 1.6% today and the regulatory targets set for the next decade represents one of the largest industrial transition opportunities in the global economy. Whoever builds the infrastructure, establishes the commercial relationships, and demonstrates real-world cost advantages during this window has a chance to define how that transition unfolds. That is the context in which Tesla's move toward Europe with its semi-truck needs to be understood. Not as a vehicle launch, not as a product announcement, but as a strategic entry into a market that is being forced to change, where the existing players have strong brand recognition and deep customer relationships, but where the underlying economics are shifting in ways that create openings for competitors with different cost structures. The Tesla Semi entered high-volume production in April of 2026 at the Nevada Gigafactory. The facility covers roughly 1.7 million square feet and is capable of producing up to 50,000 trucks per year at full capacity. Battery supply constraints mean that actual output in 2026 will likely be significantly lower, perhaps around 10,000 units, with full capacity unlikely before 2028. That production constraint is real and worth taking seriously. But it does not change the underlying economics of the vehicle itself. The numbers are worth understanding, because this is where the story gets genuinely surprising. The long-range version of the Tesla Semi carries a targeted range of 500 miles at full load, which means 82,000 pounds of gross vehicle weight, the legal maximum for U.S. highways. It charges at up to 1.2 megawatts through Tesla's Megacharger system, which means a driver can recover 60% of battery capacity in roughly 30 minutes. That 30-minute window is not arbitrary. It aligns with mandatory rest break requirements for commercial drivers in both the United States and Europe. The charging stops, in other words, do not necessarily add time to the schedule. The driver needs to stop anyway. The energy cost comparison is where the economics become difficult to ignore. In California, running the Tesla Semi costs approximately 50% less per mile on energy than running an equivalent diesel truck. In Europe, the gap is even more dramatic in certain markets. When you translate European diesel prices and electricity rates into cost per kilometer, the electric option can be roughly 10 times cheaper on a pure energy basis. 10 times. That is not an incremental improvement. That is a different category of operating cost, and once fleet operators run those numbers against their own fuel bills, the conversation changes. Real-world data is already confirming the efficiency projections. DHL ran a fully loaded Tesla Semi on a 390-mile route and logged 1.72 kilowatt-hours per mile. PepsiCo, one of the earliest commercial customers starting in late 2022, reported similar efficiency numbers using regenerative braking on their distribution routes. These are not laboratory figures. They are actual fleet operations producing actual data that procurement teams can put into spreadsheets. The total cost of ownership analysis, which is ultimately how commercial fleet operators make purchasing decisions, is starting to shift. An investment bank analysis from spring of 2026 concluded that the Tesla Semi already holds a 3% total cost of ownership advantage over the benchmark diesel alternative in the current fuel environment. 3% does not sound dramatic. But in an industry where margins are measured in fractions, and where a fleet operator running hundreds of trucks can see that 3% multiply across millions of miles per year, it matters. And that analysis was conducted at current diesel prices, which have actually declined recently. If energy costs move in either direction, the electric advantage either compresses or expands, but the structural direction of the comparison is established. Now consider what happens when that cost structure meets the European regulatory environment. Europe already grants battery electric trucks an additional 4 tons of allowable gross vehicle weight on public roads compared to diesel equivalents. That is not a small accommodation. For freight operators, every additional ton of cargo capacity is revenue. The regulatory system is not just penalizing diesel. It is actively incentivizing electrification through weight allowances, toll differentials, and purchasing incentives. The economic argument for switching is being reinforced from multiple directions simultaneously. Tesla's approach to the European market reveals something about its strategy that goes beyond selling trucks. In June of 2026, Tesla posted business development positions in Munich specifically focused on heavy-duty charging and megacharger infrastructure. The truck announcement had not yet been formalized for Europe, but the infrastructure hiring came first. That sequencing is intentional. Tesla built its competitive position in passenger vehicles partly through its supercharger network, which created a refueling infrastructure advantage that competitors spent years trying to replicate. The megacharger strategy for heavy trucks appears to follow the same logic. Build the network. Establish the standard. Make switching costs work in your favor. This matters because the charging infrastructure question is the most serious obstacle to electric truck adoption at scale, and not just for Tesla. Any fleet operator considering a transition to battery electric trucks has to ask where the trucks will charge when they are away from the depot. Depot charging, where trucks return to a central facility overnight, works well for regional distribution. But long-haul freight requires a public charging network that does not yet exist at the density needed for widespread adoption. If Tesla's megacharger build-out in Europe creates a viable corridor charging network before competitors establish their own infrastructure, the commercial implications extend well beyond Tesla's own truck sales. Other electric truck manufacturers would potentially need access to that network. Fleet operators would potentially find their charging decisions locked to whatever infrastructure reaches critical mass first. The competition Tesla faces in Europe is serious and should not be underestimated. Volvo Trucks is currently the market leader in battery electric truck sales across Europe, with an ambitious target of achieving 70% zero-emission vehicle sales by 2030. Mercedes-Benz, Scania, MAN, and DAF all have established products in the market, deep relationships with fleet operators built over decades, and service networks covering the entire continent. When a trucking company in Poland or Spain or Italy needs a vehicle serviced at 2 in the morning on a highway, the name on the door of the nearest repair facility matters enormously. That network advantage is real, and it is something Tesla will need years to build. But here is what makes the competitive picture interesting rather than simply lopsided. Tesla's pricing on the Semi is roughly $260,000 for the standard range version and $290,000 for the long range. The Mercedes e-Actros 600, a direct competitor in the European long-haul segment, is priced at roughly $450,000. That is not a small gap. It is close to double the price for a vehicle with somewhat less range and slower charging capability. When fleet operators run the math on total cost of ownership over a 10 to 15-year vehicle lifetime, that purchase price difference is substantial even before accounting for energy savings. The question worth sitting with is not whether Tesla will dominate the European truck market. It probably will not, at least not quickly. The question is what the economic consequences look like if electric trucking reaches even 20 or 30% of new truck sales in Europe over the next decade. Freight costs in Europe represent a meaningful percentage of the final price of almost every manufactured good sold on the continent. If those costs decline significantly, the effects flow through supply chains, retail prices, manufacturing margins, and corporate profitability in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict in advance. Consider what has happened historically when transportation costs declined sharply. The expansion of the American railroad network in the 19th century reduced freight costs so dramatically that it fundamentally changed what could be produced where and what could be sold to whom. The interstate highway system, one of the largest public works programs in American history, did the same thing for road freight in the 20th century. Containerization transformed international trade in the 1960s and 70s by standardizing cargo handling and reducing shipping costs far enough to make global supply chains economically viable. Each of these transitions seemed, in its early stages, like a story about a specific technology. Each one turned out to be a story about the economics of moving things and about who captured value when those economics changed. Research from the National Bureau of Economic Research has found that transportation productivity improvements have historically increased real economic output by roughly 3.3%, which is approximately 2.3 times greater than freight transportation's proportional share of economic value added. In other words, when freight gets cheaper and faster, the economic benefits multiply through the broader economy at a rate that exceeds the direct size of the transportation sector. That is the kind of second-order effect that gets missed when people focus only on the truck itself. There are real obstacles that deserve honest acknowledgement. The battery weight penalty for electric trucks is a genuine issue. Heavier batteries reduce the cargo a truck can legally carry, which affects freight economics directly. Charging infrastructure deployment across European freight corridors is a significant undertaking that will take years and substantial capital. Battery supply constraints are limiting production in the near term, and the adoption timeline for something as capital-intensive as commercial trucking fleets is measured in years and decades, not quarters. None of these obstacles disappear because the underlying economics are compelling. So here is the question worth asking yourself. If you were a logistics company executive in 2026, looking at regulatory deadlines, energy cost differentials, emerging total cost of ownership advantages, and the early evidence from real-world fleet operations, at what point would you start treating this not as an experiment to watch from a distance, but as a strategic transition to begin planning for? That calculation is being made by procurement teams at major logistics companies right now, and the answers will determine how quickly this market develops. This was never really a story about a truck going to Europe. It was a story about what happens when the economics that have governed the movement of physical goods for more than a century begin to change. The diesel engine did not just power trucks. It powered an entire system of commerce with supply chains, manufacturing locations, distribution networks, and retail pricing structures all built around assumptions about what it costs to move things from one place to another. When those assumptions start shifting, the effects travel far beyond the transportation industry itself. If diesel helped build the modern freight economy, what happens to that economy when the economics that made diesel dominant begin to change? That question does not have a simple answer yet. But the people who are thinking seriously about it now, before the answer becomes obvious, are the ones who tend to be in the best position when the transition accelerates. For more analysis on the industrial and economic shifts that are reshaping how wealth is created and how industries rise and fall, subscribe so you do not get caught off guard by what is already in motion.